Okay, we're going to keep letting people in. Right now, we're up to 81 people, so that's great. Welcome, everyone. I am Lad Biermann. I am the Executive Director of the State League. And we're so happy to see so many people interested in learning more about redistricting. As many of you know, we've had a couple of different webinars, a couple in January, and now each one just gets a little bit more into the weeds and a little bit more detail on how redistricting is going to work and how we're hoping you all can work with us on getting the lines drawn in your communities. So the past redistricting webinars that we've held, as well as other resources and materials, are all on our state website. You can go to lwvny.org, and under our work, you'll see there's a redistricting page, or you can go straight to nyredistricting.org. And so that's newyorkredistricting.org, and it'll take you directly to the page on our website. So, and that's where they're archived, and there's lots of information there. So if you're looking for other information, go to that page. Now, what we're going to ask is if Jennifer Wilson is the Deputy Director of the State League, and she has a presentation she's going to do tonight. And we ask that everyone go on mute, including my dogs, while we have the presentation. If you think of questions, throw them in the chat. Hopefully you've all learned by now where chat is on Zoom. Down at the bottom, you should see 3 dots. And if you hover over it, you can, or click on it, you'll see chat. The chat box will come up, and enter your question in there. If we can, we'll answer it while we're moving on. If not, we'll send it over to Jennifer, and when she's done with the presentation, we will get those questions answered. Also, if you'd like to verbally ask or orally ask your question, just tell us that in the chat too, and we'll call on you later. With 85 people on, it gets a little out of control if everyone just starts talking all at once. So if we have it in the chat and you can just say, I'd like to, ask a question, we will call on you when the presentation is over. So I will now turn it over to Jennifer, and I will go on mute as well. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Laura. And as I talked about with Barbara at the beginning of this, yes, we are recording, and we will have this available tomorrow later in the day on the website that Laura mentioned, nyredistricting.org. So we'll have that up there. And this presentation is really building on the 2 presentations we had back in January. It feels like a lifetime ago, well, not that long ago, where we're essentially talking about our people-powered fair maps campaign. So our first meeting was the kickoff of the campaign. We kind of laid the groundwork of how redistricting works in New York State, or how it's supposed to work this year in New York State, as well as a panel discussion that we also had in January, where we had 3 experts on redistricting come and talk to us about how redistricting works, how we can get engaged in the redistricting process, and the importance of getting engaged in the redistricting process. And the next component of this is talking more specifically about communities of interest. What are communities of interest? How do I figure out what my community of interest is? And how do I engage communities of interest around New York State? And this presentation is really a train the trainer training. So our hope is that after you see this presentation, that you will, if you're interested in working on this, that you'll connect with your local league president to get involved in the campaign and to help with some of the educational components of the campaign. And we'll have this slide deck available for a more public audience, so not necessarily geared towards league members. As you'll see as we go through, this is very much geared at league members. The one we'll have prepared for you is just for the public, helping people figure out what is my community of interest, and also why does it matter? Why does it matter that I identify my community of interest? So just as a quick recap for anyone who wasn't able to watch or attend our campaign kickoff, what is the People Powered Fair Maps campaign? This is a National League-led campaign in all 50 states and the District of Columbia, essentially trying to have fair maps, fair representative maps in all of those areas at the local level, the municipal level, the county level, the state level, and the federal level. So we're working through a number of different options in terms of trying to get fair maps. So ballot initiatives and referendums, state constitutional options in some of the states. There's some state fixes in some of the states. Oops, sorry, everybody. But everyone across the board is working on civic engagement and education. And this is part of that pillar of the campaign. So just looking at more specifically what we're doing here in New York State, we want to educate the public. We want to build partnerships with diverse stakeholder groups. We want to engage the community in community mapping, and we want to advocate for fair maps. And each of these components is going to look a little different depending on your local league in New York State. I've had a number of meetings with local league leaders. In fact, I'm almost done with my meetings. I think I have like 5 left, which is great. Identifying local league leaders who want to work on this campaign and working with them to see how this campaign is going to work best for their particular area of the state. As I've learned, county and municipal redistricting is extremely different across the state. So it's going to look a little bit different everywhere, but in total, we want everyone to at least be doing education on this because it is so important that New Yorkers know how this works and why it's so important. So what is redistricting? Again, we're taking it very back to basic for anyone who's missed any of our last presentations. Every 10 years, we have the census to check on our population count, see who's living there, who's moved in, who's moved out, what does our population look like, what are their issues and interests, and we take that population data and we go ahead and we redistrict at the state and congressional level, and then localities, either the following year or that same year, in some cases, but in not all cases, as I've learned, will redistrict for town, county, and city legislative seats as well. And here is the US League's criteria for what, sorry, hold on one second, I just got one person in the waiting room, for what we consider as our fair maps, what we consider to be helping us have fair districts. So we want populations to be as equal as possible. We want geographic contiguity, which basically means we want the district to be completely touching. We don't want any situation where I'm drawing out my district map on a piece of paper and I have to lift up my pen. We want to have a promotion of fair partisan fairness. We don't want to have one party necessarily in charge. We want to have fairness. Preservation and protection of communities of interest, respect for boundaries of municipalities and counties. We don't want to be splitting up any counties, and compactness and competitiveness may also be a criteria as well. And we're going to dig a little bit into what the actual federal rules and state rules are around redistricting and mapping as well. And you'll see that the league's criteria is very similar to what the law actually is. So how does redistricting work in New York State? So as we have talked about in past presentations, it's a little different than this year than it has been in any other cycle. We now have a constitutional amendment that created an independent redistricting commission. This is a 10-member commission that has been appointed. These are just some of the rules around the appointments. So it's 2 members are appointed by each of the parties in each of the houses. So 2 majority Senate, 2 minority Senate, 2 majority Assembly, 2 minority Assembly, and then the first 8 members appoint the last 2 members who cannot be affiliated with either of the major parties. And then here's also some rules to make sure that this commission is not going to be influenced by any sort of outside actors, making sure that they weren't a lobbyist or a sitting state legislator within the last 3 years. They're not related to anybody who's currently a seated or a spouse, not necessarily related, but a spouse of anyone who has been a legislator or is a legislator, and that they're not affiliated with a party as the chairman within the last 3 years. So on the mapping, there's federal mandates and then there's state mandates. So at the federal level in our US Constitution, there's 2 mandates around making sure that populations for congressional districts are as equal as possible. And same thing with state legislative districts, they have to be substantially equal. It doesn't necessarily say what substantially means, it just says substantially equal. And then outside of the Constitution, the Voting Rights Act, Section 2 prohibits plans that intentionally or inadvertently discriminate on the basis of race, which could dilute the minority vote. But this also gets a little bit tricky because districts can't be created on the basis of race the other way. So we can't dilute the vote, but we also cannot create a district strictly based on the color of someone's skin. That's not allowed either. So on the New York State level, we talked about some of these with our lead criteria. They need to be compact, contiguous, so we're not lifting up our pen, we're making sure that they're compact, they're not like these crazy big districts, but then also these other size districts that are smaller. We're going to preserve political subdivision, preserve communities of interest, which we're going to dig into today, preserve the core of prior districts, so we're not going to break up counties or we're not going to break up municipalities or anything, and we want them to be competitive. We don't want to draw a district that's just always going to have the same type of party or person winning all the time. And we don't want to intentionally favor or disfavor an incumbent candidate or party. And that's another area where it kind of gets a little tricky, because much like race, you can't just draw a district based on a party. So this whole conversation around the lines of districts and the rules, we are planning to have a much bigger conversation around this down the road with some real legal experts who can probably answer your questions better than I can. So hopefully within the next month or two, we'll have an announcement of some sort of option for some sort of panel discussion about this, because I know this is where it's really complicated and kind of hard to understand. So here's a quick outline of the calendar for redistricting in New York State. And I'm sure most of you on this call have heard that the census population counts have been pushed back to September, as late as September 30th, I've heard. And technically, the commission has to have their first draft of maps by September 15th to the public, so the public can review them. There is also a constitutional mandate to have 12 public hearings. I've heard that they may be held virtually, but they have to be representative of these areas. These areas are specified from the 2014 amendment in our state constitution, and you can see them all listed out here. You can see it's all the upstate cities, as well as Long Island, New York City, the 5 boroughs, the 2 counties of Long Island. So it's really making sure that every single part of New York State is going to be heard in the conversation around redistricting. And then adhering to this, the commission has to have their maps to the legislature for the legislature to vote on them by January 1st. If the legislature rejects the maps, the commission can get a second bite at the apple. They have to be notified by the end of February, and then they have to resubmit their maps again, which is another hard date, because the New York State, as a lot of you know from doing your work around your candidate forums and Vote 411, the petitioning process for those legislative seats, the Senate and Assembly and congressional seats, starts at the end of February. So there's potentially going to be some legislative action to move some of these dates around to help accommodate the fact that the census data is coming out so late, and that the deadline, if the first maps are rejected, is going to be right when the petitioning process starts. So expect to see some amendments to this timeline potentially within the next couple of months, or even weeks, maybe, I'm not sure. Hopefully weeks, so sooner the better. So moving on to the actual sort of meat and potatoes of this webinar, what we have called you all here today is talking about communities of interest. I mentioned in the mapping rules that communities of interest have to be preserved. It's really important to preserve communities of interest, but what is a community of interest? So this is just sort of the broad definition of a community of interest is basically a group of people who all live within a similar area and they all have similar concerns. So it could be an ethnic or racial or economic group. It could be people sharing religion or sharing churches. A community of interest could include a single school district area. All of our kids in the area all go to the same school district. Or we all share the same public transit. We all take this bus to go shopping, to go to work, or we all share the same media. Everyone here reads the same paper. All of these things could qualify as a community of interest. I know that sounds extremely broad, and hopefully some of the prompts in this presentation will help you think about this on a more micro level and kind of figure out your own community of interest. So I wanted to give some specific New York State examples of what could qualify as a community of interest. So my first category is work. We all work, or our family members work. So if you live in an area where the university, so let's say SUNY Fredonia, is the #1 employer, that could be considered a community of interest. Or maybe your hospital, Upstate Medical Center, I use Albany Medical Center as the example. Everyone here is a doctor or nurse or their staff at the hospital, that could be considered a community of interest. Or we're all engineers, we all work at GE in Schenectady, that's our community of interest. Then I also put here a similar economic or environmental concerns could qualify your community as a community of interest. So let's say we have really bad water quality. Hoosick Falls, unfortunately, is an example of an area that had awful water quality. That's a community of interest. In Long Island, the property taxes are insane. That's a community of interest. Or an area that might have high rates of unemployment or poverty, like the Bronx, that's a community of interest too. And then finally, communities with similar values or belief systems. So let's say like the Amish community in the Mohawk Valley or Native American tribes in Oneida. All of these different groups are communities of interest. And you as an individual, you might have multiple communities of interest that you consider yourself a part of. And identifying that is important because it kind of helps you relate to these different groups and thinking about kind of the spatial awareness of the groups. So maybe my kids all go to this one school district, but I work somewhere else, but I'm taking the same public transit as other people to get to where I work, and maybe I shop over there. That whole area could be considered your community of interest and be relevant to the redistricting process. So why is it important to engage with communities of interest, in particular related to redistricting? I think a lot of the people on this webinar probably know all about gerrymandering, cracking and packing, but for those of you who don't, because I know when I came into this, I didn't fully understand it, I thought some visuals would be helpful in understanding cracking and packing. I didn't make these, I gave credit to the groups that did make these, but essentially cracking and packing is either cracking apart a community of interest to dilute their vote over multiple district areas or packing them into one district. So we dilute their vote when the legislators go to a larger body. So here I have the purple ward and the gray ward. The purple ward is the majority, but only by 10%. And in the first example, we drew the lines just strictly across. And in that example, purple has all of the districts when really gray should probably have one of the districts. So in that case, it would be an example of cracking. We cracked apart gray so that we diluted their vote in every single district. In the second example, we drew the lines fairly. Gray, or we didn't draw the lines fairly, we drew the lines the opposite way. We packed the gray into one district, or into two districts, and then we diluted the purple district across the three districts. And in the second example I have here, which has a multitude of options, we've got 60% blue, 40% red. In the first example, it's a perfect representation. We have 3 blue districts and 2 red districts. In the second one, it's a compact, the districts are compact, but they're not fair. So blue has all of the districts and red has 0. And then in the last example, you can see it's not compact nor fair. It looks a little crazy. And blue has 2 districts and red has 3. And so red wins, even though technically they're in the minority of voters in this case. So I'm going to leave this up for a second just so like people can kind of digest it, because like I said, I know this was very confusing for me, and it wasn't until I found these graphics that I was like, oh, okay, I think I get cracking and packing. So basically, when we're thinking of these 2 colors as the communities of interest, we don't want to draw the districts in a way that anyone's vote is being diluted, either by spreading them out or smushing them together. So here's some tips for identifying your community of interest. So the first thing is probably the most important thing, which is the league should not be the only voice to define what a fair map is. And in the conversations we've been having with local leagues, we've been kind of talking about the different options to engage in the redistricting process. And not every local league is going to draw a map. We are going to have some trainings on some free map making software within the next month that local leagues can use and try. And, you know, if they want to put forward a map, that's totally fine with us. But we want to make sure that if you are drawing maps, that you're engaging with other groups, that you're not just saying, or I'm not just saying, okay, this is my community of interest, and I can look around and see that these are all the other communities of interest, and I'm just going to draw a map for all of us. We want to make sure that we're engaging with these other groups, that we're empowering them to maybe make their own maps to help guide their their own decisions, their own public comment into this process. And the ultimate goal really of all of this, and of this presentation, all the presentations that are going to come out after this, is we want these different organizations to have a voice in this process. And we want to make sure that they have all the tools they need if they want to draw maps, if they want to submit testimony, if they want to get involved in this and do their own public education within their community. We want to give them the tools they need to do that. So the most important thing in this entire campaign, the number one thing, if we only do this, it's the best thing we can do, which is collaboration with other organizations. So we also want to not assume what communities of interest are in our area. It's a great time to be curious and ask questions. There's a certain level of, I live in my area, I've lived here 10 years. I know what it was like the last time we did the census. I can see what it's like now. I've seen what stores have gone up. I've seen what new housing has gone up. I've seen what new churches have come in. I know all about it. But there might be something that you're missing, something that you're not aware of. So it's a great time to, again, get involved with other organizations that you maybe haven't even thought of talking to, and kind of seeing their whole perspective on what the community actually looks like, how it's changed since the last census, and what are some of the different social economic programs that maybe people are taking advantage of that can help kind of guide these conversations too. So here, again, we listed, economic and agriculture, transportation routes, school districts, union membership. There's all kinds of different things that can help us define our community of interest and figure out where the district line should be so that we're making sure those communities are best represented. And again, we might not necessarily be the ones doing the map making. We at the state level, we're not going to be putting forward any full state assembly, full state senate, full congressional map. We may be supporting other groups' maps or supporting other groups' comments, but we're not going to outright say, yep, that's the perfect map, that's the one. And in truth, there's going to be groups that represent the same populations that are going to disagree on what the best map should be. That happened the last cycle, and it's probably going to happen this cycle again. So the best things we can do for people is give them education, or not give them education, to help them become educated about the redistricting process, to help train them on certain tools. I listed here Representable, which is one of the mapping tools we're going to be doing a demo on in the next couple of weeks. It's a very amazing mapping tool, very easy to use, that is specifically about communities of interest, and encouraging them, giving them encouragement, letting them know there's like really no wrong way to engage in this. As long as you're being collaborative, as long as you're being respectful, there's no wrong way to get involved in this. So let's do a little practice and figure out what communities of interest you're in. So these are some prompts that National shared with us to kind of start thinking about our own communities of interest. So they're very general. So if you have like a piece of paper, or even like open up notes on your phone, or if you even want to put some of this stuff in the chat. So think about like, where do you live? Where do your kids go to school? Or maybe your grandkids go to school? Where do you go to shop for groceries? Where do you work? What's the closest hospital? Pre-COVID, where did you like to socialize? Where do you like to worship? Do you take public transit? What station is closest to you? Can you walk to essential stores? And what public services do you rely on? Just kind of like think about some of these, write them down. I'll open up the chat now, and so I can see it too. And yeah, and just take like a minute or two to kind of like think these through. So these are the prompts. When National did it, they had people drop them in the chat, but I'm not sure if that's gonna get a little crazy. But these are the prompts that, as you're having meetings, are kind of like what we'd like you to kind of be asking the group. And in a smaller setting, like let's say you did a presentation for your local like food bank, and they let people kind of join, or your local library, and maybe it was like a group of 10. It's super helpful to let people actually say these out loud. So Mary Cronson says she's part of a town with older housing stock and lots of students. Yes, you are, Mary. And yeah, and I think Mary's point is important too. Don't forget about the students in this, even though they're home right now. It could be helpful if you have a professor you often talk to for your different programs, maybe see to like invite students at university to participate in this over Zoom, even though Zoom is sometimes limited because I can't see you guys in a room and like have a conversation about these with you. There's still a lot of positives as well. So let's go ahead and move ahead. So now that you have kind of thought through your community of interest, or if you're presenting this out that your group has thought through your community of interest, that's great. So now you've thought about what communities you're a part of. And these are all the places, if we're thinking geographically, where we might find you and those who are also part of your community of interest. So you might match up with other people near you. If you're presenting this group, hopefully the group will say similar things in common. But remember that there are, this is for the league, there's league members everywhere. So in a lot of cases, our communities of interest that are within these larger congressional, state assembly, state senate districts might go over multiple counties, which part of this campaign is trying to link together some of those areas of the state where there might be multiple counties, multiple local leagues included. And that's something that we're working forward on. So now that we've identified our communities of interest, we're kind of thinking about our communities of interest, what groups we might want to reach out to, what are we actually asking them to do? So we want to identify our community and we want to build partnerships with them, but you can't just necessarily walk up to a group you've maybe never worked with and be like, hey, we're partners now and we're going to work on redistricting together. We want to make sure that we're approaching this in a way that we're establishing a long-term partnership ideally. So we want to ask permission, we want to establish trust, and we want to follow community leaders. So I know a lot of you local league leaders and local league members already have amazing groups that you work with and partner with on voter registration drives, on candidate forums, on different educational campaigns already. So you maybe want to reach out to them first and sort of ask them like, hey, are there other groups that you work with that you think we can partner together on with doing redistricting education and redistricting outreach? And part of what we're doing at the state level too is putting together a stakeholder list for each of our local leagues to help them with their outreach. Our intern Sarah is helping to put those lists together. It's ongoing. Some local leagues have already gotten their list, some are waiting for their list. But basically it has organizations within the community, a contact, if Sarah can identify a contact information, so phone number, email address, a website link, their physical address as well. So that way local leagues can start thinking about some other groups that maybe they haven't worked with before. And all of this information, including this PowerPoint slide deck, are going to be part of a new Google Drive we're putting together as well, so that all of this information for local league leaders who are doing this work is in one spot. The New York Redistricting.org website, also nyredistricting.org, we technically own both URLs, but that's really for the public. That has so much information about the old task force, LAT4. It has information from academics and experts on this. All of LWB US's webinars that are relevant to us are on there. It's just like very much public facing, whereas this Google Drive we're putting together is going to be more for helping local league leaders do trainings for their different stakeholder groups. So on relationship building, here's some other things to kind of think about related to this. So like I said, we're putting together these stakeholder lists, but as you're kind of thinking through this too, when COVID wasn't happening, was there certain places people met together, certain community centers, libraries are a great example here where they might be willing to kind of partner to do educational outreach. Religious centers, maybe your local YMCA, economic centers, schools, community centers, libraries listed here, certain grocery stores and restaurants, but also thinking virtually. The Nextdoor app is really handy and it's a very fun app, but seeing if there's a way to use that to sort of bridge the gap with redistricting, maybe putting, it's kind of like Facebook, but for neighbors specifically, so that neighbors can post on there about lost dog, or I'm looking to buy a lawnmower, things like that locally. And, you can post on there and say like, hey, like redistricting is, the census is on, redistricting is coming up. Are people interested in learning about redistricting? Facebook groups, of course. I know a lot of local leagues are on Facebook, but also, again, local government or library websites are always really great as well. And then once we're setting up these communities one-on-ones, we want to make sure that we're having a very collaborative discussion. We want to make sure that we're kind of meeting them where they are, seeing their interest in this, and making sure that we're not necessarily kind of not pushing ourselves on them, but that we're not talking down to them. We're just kind of meeting them where they are and starting the conversation on redistricting. And then as we move forward and have more conversations, helping them to prepare testimonies, helping them to create public comment that they can submit either at the state level to the commission or locally. In some cases, there's opportunity to submit public comment. And we will have a training on creating testimonies when we do find out when the public hearings may be held at the state level. The National League had done a training on this already that League of Women Voters of Washington presented. The video is on our nyredistricting.org landing page. So if you're interested in that, definitely check that out. It was an excellent presentation on actually putting together testimonies, giving testimonies, and how to do it related to redistricting so that it's not in the weeds. It's very much storytelling, talking about your community and how redistricting relates to it and how these district lines relate to it. And the most important thing is this takes time. And kind of at the beginning of this, we talked about the census timeline's been pushed back, but it might seem like, oh, we're starting so early, they're not going to have the data till September, but this is the time to start building the trust, building the relationships, having the conversations, seeing different groups' levels of interest in this. So that way, when we do find out about hearings, either locally or at the state level, your groups are ready to go. Your partnerships are already rock solid and your stakeholder groups have their pieces of paper ready with their public comment on there that they can submit. So finally, kind of a recap of everything. We've established the trust. We are having meaningful relationships. So what are we actually asking them to do? We're asking them to give public testimony at public hearings or give testimony at public hearings, or just submit comment is also totally fine. Sharing their story in a written or visual format. Again, we're going to have some map making software trainings that we'll be doing soon, or just in a written format too. Having someone, write down and kind of explain their community of interest, talking about who's moved in, who's moved out, and why it's so important to redistrict in a different way that is more representative of their community is just as good as having a picture of a map. Participating in the map drawing process, like I said, we'll have that, those different programs we'll do trainings on. And then from the league standpoint, having you all volunteer for People-Powered Fair Maps events. We are hoping that, like I said, all of our local leagues will be doing some sort of educational outreach on this, and hopefully we will have lots of people help promote those different events. So why is it so important to articulate our asks as we're going into this? We want to make sure that as we go into this, we are saying what we're expecting, but not being too forceful, and that we're meeting these groups where they are so we can build trust, build understanding, show our commitment to this work, making sure that we are letting these groups know that, hey, that we're not just here to do a presentation on, okay, this is redistricting in New York State, we'll see you in 10 years. We want to have a long-term partnership with you. And we want to also keep track so that way we're making sure we reach our goals. We may have some more information about this in the future because LWV US is very much trying to keep track of how the different states are doing on this. And again, we want these to be long-term partnerships so that way when COVID's over, we can have those in-person voter registration drives together. We can, let's say it's a food pantry you never talked to before, we can go to the food pantry. It's a church we never worked with before, and now we're working with on redistricting. We can go to the church, we can do voter registration drives. So really, this redistricting is so crucial to our mission because we are a good government organization, but in the long term, it's going to help us continue to achieve our goal of empowering and engaging voters. So next steps are start to connect with your stakeholder community groups. And again, if you're a member who hasn't engaged in the redistricting conversations we've been having yet and isn't a leader at the higher level within their local league, talk to your local league president about who those people are. I know a lot of local leagues are still working on identifying who their redistricting champion is within their local league. So if you think that could be you, talk to your local league president about that and start to plan a community of interest training. It doesn't have to happen right away, but, you know, as you're having these stakeholder conversations, start to think about maybe in the next month or two having a training. And then planning a community roundtable can also be really helpful if you do a number of community of interest trainings, and you can have a roundtable and bring all of the groups together virtually. And getting familiar with your local redistricting process, as I mentioned at the beginning, it's very different all over the state. And I'm having a very hard time making a list of how it works in every single county and municipality, but I think I'm getting there. So if you are getting familiar with your own local redistricting process and you don't think you're going to want to engage in the state assembly, state senate, and congressional aspect of this, maybe next year, if your process is next year, you'll be able to engage next year. So with that, I'm going to take my screen away and look at the chat, and we can open it up for any questions. Oh, I see Nancy, is your hand up?
How large a geographic area are these communities of interest?
I think it's going to really depend. So some communities of interest might be pretty small. Like there's no definition of how big a community of interest could be. I mean, you could even consider New York State technically a community of interest as like a state. But you know, I think the first step to helping think about that is working with the stakeholder group. So like, let's say maybe one of the groups you're going to connect with is like the urban league in your area, and the people who are members of the urban league might be able to tell you, or even within your own local league, you might get a better sense of like how big they are, but there isn't really necessarily any hard and fast rules on that.
Nancy, part of it, Jennifer, if I can just add to that, part of it is that it might be when they draw the lines, they put together 4 different communities of interest, or 2 different communities of interest, or something like that. It's not that each community of interest is going to have its own district, but the idea is this is a community of interest. So when they draw the maps, they shouldn't divide that, or we prefer that not be divided. So if that helps kind of think it through.
Yeah, thank you.
I think Kathleen, I can't tell what your last name is. I think your hand's raised. If you'd like to ask a question.
Has the league statewide at least identified areas where the districting seems so inappropriate and out of sync with obvious communities of interest?
Yeah, I don't know that we've done an updated. We had in 2014, when the amendment was pending, we had done with NYPIRG a report on all of the crazy district lines that were drawn very obvious to gerrymander for a given party. And that, I think, is one of the things I have on my to-do list, is to sort of look back at that and rehash that out. But I can't tell you off the top of my head, like I don't have it handy right now, but it was something that we did look at in 2014.
Hello. I have a question. Is it possible that environmental factors become part of redistricting, so that resources, not just social, but water or electricity or other resource issues in a community become part of that?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, one of the examples we used was water quality in Hoosick Falls. Here in Albany County, we had a really big problem with oil tankers sitting near community housing, and that was an environmental factor. So yeah, I think it is really broad, the whole term community of interest, because it really is any sort of issue or shared problem, shared concern, or just shared way of living could really qualify your community of interest.
Because I live in Rockland County, New York, and my district is divided so that 1/3 of my county is in a different legislative district. But we have a common water problem where we exceed, through one water company as a monopoly, cancerous agents in our water. So in my mind, to a certain degree, resources like that should be part of a redistricting platform, because you divide us by our vote and perhaps our ethnicity in different ways, but we have a common water problem that the legislature doesn't deal with as one district.
I mean, honestly, Gail, that would be a great public comment or testimony to submit to, I don't know how Rockland County Legislature does their redistricting. I haven't looked into Rockland yet. It's one of the ones on my to-do list still. But yeah, no, you're exactly right that there's so many different factors to consider. And that's part of the reason that having these preliminary conversations with groups is so important, because yeah, what you said is basically exactly testimony I feel like I would hear if I went to a redistricting commission's hearing, is exactly what you just said.
I think Susan Robinson has a question, Jennifer.
Okay.
You got to unmute yourself, Susan.
I know I'm getting there. I'm a little slow,
That's all right.
on the draw.
It's okay.
I'm new to all of this, and I'm wondering if there's any past maps that we can look at to see how it's been done in the past.
Yes, the current New York State legislative maps for state assembly, state senate, and congressional districts are all on the legislative apportionment task force, LAT4's website. And the link to that website is on our nyredistricting.org page. As far as the local maps, typically the county clerk has those maps. And usually I found for Vote 411 purposes, the majority of those maps are available online in a GIS format where you can see the different local town, city, and county legislative district lines as well. So those you'll have to search individually, unfortunately. But yes, I'll just put it in the chat for ease.
Right. So the question then becomes, since I'm new to this, how do I confer with my good friend Google and pull up the right thing? Do I just type in Westchester County redistricting maps?
Yes, yeah, Westchester County will probably have the legislative maps actually all in one spot, because I think Westchester is one of the better counties on that. But I know Kathy Mimi is on here. So Kathy, if you wanna drop it in the chat, I think that could be helpful too.
Yeah, actually, Susan, I will actually email, in fact, I'll email our whole redistricting committee that we're just forming, because we actually pulled all the maps together last fall for election season. So
Okay.
they're done.
Okay.
We got them.
All right. Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
I see we have two.
Laura, I think, has her hand up. Go ahead, Laura.
So I'm just wondering, since an individual or a small group of people could belong to so many multiple communities of interest, you know, it just seems to me that it's more a matter of geography and this contiguity than it is contiguousness than it is anything else. Because if we went by our individual issues, you could say, well, I agree with the guy over there who's 20 miles from me on that issue, but I agree with the person next door to me on this issue. So, you know what I mean? It starts to become a matter of perspective, as opposed to when you look at some of those drawings you showed us at the start, they were clearly being redrawn in order to give a political benefit to one group. And it seems to me that that's what you would be trying to eliminate.
Yeah, and the community of interest, the communities of interest in general, it is very broad. And it does seem like when we think about the basics of redistricting, especially for like a congressional district, especially like we think of like upstate where a congressional district might cover 13 counties, it kind of feels like, oh, well, maybe it doesn't even matter. But on the local level, I've heard of towns that were split into 3. I've heard of, municipal boundaries that were split into 4 different jurisdictions. We just heard from Gail, where she lives, they're split up as well, so that their water quality problem it falls off the map. Gail has a perfect example of why it's so important to keep a community of interest intact at every single level of government. Because let's say out in Hoosick Falls, they split Hoosick Falls, and we have this water issue, and our legislator doesn't really care because the part of his district that covers the area with the water quality is such a small piece of the larger district that it doesn't matter. I don't even need your votes to get reelected, basically, is what I'm saying, for that particular issue. And if we want to engage people in this and let them know that it's important, we want to make sure that we're kind of hearing where they're at. We want to make sure that we understand these different groups that we're working with and like what their interests are and why they're interested in redistricting, and kind of translating that into the larger picture of redrawing our state assembly and state senate and congressional maps. Because if I tell somebody, yeah, so, our legislator, he doesn't really care about us because we're such a small part of his district, and the majority of our district has been gerrymandered in this way that he only cares about these other voters. Somebody might not really care. They'll be like, okay, well, I don't really care. But if I tell them, hey, our district has been gerrymandered and now our school gets no money because our legislator who has the school in his district, he doesn't care if he gets our votes, and now your kid is sharing a textbook with the kid next to them, they're going to care about that a lot more because that's what they would consider their community of interest. So yes, we definitely, the kind of broader picture here of like, yeah, we need to be contiguous, we need to have our districts be compact, and we don't want them to look like Abraham Lincoln riding a vacuum cleaner as one of our state senate seats does. But we do definitely want to make sure that we're kind of telling people like, why does this matter? Like, why does it matter to say what your community of interest is and then translate that into the bigger kind of picture of redistricting. I hope that makes sense. I feel like I just rambled a lot.
I don't know. I sort of feel like you could redistrict the 50 states in the union by that definition. So it's almost a little scary. I mean, I really wonder, the more I listen to it, the more I wonder, like, so what are we really doing here? So, but I'll save that for another discussion another day. So,
Suzanne, did you want to comment? You're muted, Suzanne.
I was just going to say Gail's example is actually quite good, because what Gail would want to do is find other organizations or people that she can gather together to address this. And you don't go and address it as an individual that this is my community of interest. You need to bring your community of interest together and present it as testimony from that community of interest, not as an individual. You're part of it, but what Gail would do would be gather people and say, don't we want to have this be change in the next redistricting so we can all address this problem together, and bring all those people together to testify and say, listen, we want to be together in this. And so it takes the individual out of it. Yes, you want to recognize where you are, but when people are asked to recognize where they are and they come together with those people, it's very powerful testimony sometimes.
Eileen, I think you have a question. Eileen Nadelson.
Okay,
ahead, Eileen.
I may be wrong about this, but isn't there a lot of weight given to the political affiliation, and how much weight is that considered? How much weight do they consider that as opposed to similarities of community and community community similarities? I mean, isn't there a lot of weight done to the political affiliation for the redistricting?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I don't want to say a lot of weight because, there was quite a few things we mentioned at the beginning talking about, you don't want to have, as what do they call it, two legislators, one bed, where you might pin two incumbents against each other. You want to keep political subdivisions intact and all of that. But we also mentioned at the beginning that you cannot create a district solely based on party affiliation. So yeah, it's a factor. It's part of my community of interest, is most of my people here, we have this political ideology, but it cannot be the only basis for drawing a district.
I'm interested in knowing how much weight is given by our legislature, because they're the ones who are betting on the percentages here. we're trying to get people together to keep it similar, but they're betting on the percentages. So how much weight do we have to buck up against the political affiliation? Is it like 50% they consider that, or
I think, Eileen,
30% they consider that? Or?
Eileen, there's no percentage like that we could say. And I think what we would say, partly, I know you came in late to the conversation tonight, so you missed the beginning when Jennifer talked about the redistricting process and how there is criteria specified in the constitutional amendment that was passed in 2014, that this criteria is required to be considered when they're drawing these maps. And the one we're talking about tonight is the communities of interest, is the main focus for tonight's conversation. But the process itself, this is what in 2014 we tried to get an independent redistricting commission, because in the past it was pretty much just controlled by the legislative, the two houses and the political parties. And you should go back and look again at Jennifer's webinar from January, which is on that redistricting page. And that talks about how the old system was. Now in 2014, we did get this. Are we being idealistic? Yes, in a way. We're hopeful that we can change it and not have it be as partisan or political. And that's what the league does. We're going out to these communities and trying to get community voices to be heard on this issue and engage the people in the communities, so that we will have a stronger voice in helping to draw these lines rather than making it a political process. So yes, in typical league fashion, we are a little idealistic. We are dealing in a world that is very political and very partisan, but that is what our goal is, and that's what we're trying to do. So hopefully go back and look at what Jen has talked about in the other webinar, and I think it'll help you understand how the process changed now. Okay, I think Jeffrey Corin, you have your hand up if you'd like to unmute yourself with a question.
Yes, thank you. So my question is, in terms of communities of interest, could we create a list of what issues we might look at in terms of what represents a community of interest? So we might have, say, water rights or schools, or so people, when they look at this, they're saying, okay, so this makes sense. These are the things we're going to focus on, rather than just kind of leaving it out there in terms of whatever comes up. You know what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, no, I know what you're saying. And I think, did you get on late by any chance?
Yes.
Okay. We had at the beginning of this, in addition to like the prompts and everything, we had a list of employment. So who's your employer? And then some examples of potential employers. What is your like socioeconomic, like, is it high taxes? Is it water quality? Like we already mentioned. So yes, that's definitely part of this. And the handout that we will have available as well, that kind of mirrors this presentation, has that list in there as well. So yes, excellent recommendation. We will have that available.
Thank you.
Any other questions? I don't think, unless I miss, Kim Margosian, if you'd like to unmute, you have a question?
Hello, just a quick question. I think this jumping ahead, like once you identify your community of interest, and then like in the blocks, Jennifer, that you described the process, if you were to say develop like you said, a community of interest training, how would we as a person kind of even like go about that? Would we get like help from the local League of Women Voters? Like, I was just trying to think in my head, being not experienced in that, how we would go about that.
Yeah, so our hope is that all of our local leagues will take this presentation, which has been adapted to be more public facing, and do some sort of, I don't want to call it a training when it comes to like the public facing side of this, but kind of an engagement, a meeting with the stakeholder groups that they're going to be talking with. And, ideally that's a stakeholder group that represents other groups. So let's say it's like the Center for Disabilities, and they're going to bring the clients that they serve in to sit in to have this meeting to talk about what is a community of interest, what is their community of interest, and have this discussion about their community of interest, how it relates to redistricting. That's based on this slide deck. So it's very similar to this. And then eventually the sort of long-term hope would be that the groups can all come together. If they're all having the similar area, they're all having these similar issues, these similar interests, these similar policy goals, shall we say, we want them to all come together and to think about community mapping. But the other piece of this that we were considering doing tonight, but decided it was better to leave it for another night, is actually looking at some of the mapping software. And like I said, there is one program, and I'll put the link to the program in the chat, representable.org, that is based out of Princeton. It's students that make it, which is super cool. And it's a very community of interest based program. It is essentially a Google map overlaid with census blocks. So you can see your parks, you can see your schools, you can see your street name, where you live. And as a user, you can input into a text function. It prompts you to say, what are issues that are important to you? What do you see as the biggest issue facing your community? Where do you think your community is? And then you can actually select the census blocks and link together a map so that a person can go in here, they can write out what they think their community of interest is. They can plug in on the map using the census blocks where they think their community of interest is. And then they can either just export that to submit that to a commission or a legislative body, depending on how redistricting is being done at your local level, or they can take that and overlay it onto a different software program like Dave's Redistricting app, which is another free mapping software, and actually start to play around with population data and all of that. So Representable is the very basic, easy to use one. But then we're also going to try and have trainings for some of these more advanced programs like Dave's Redistricting app and DistrictR that are much more advanced. Okay, we have census population data within these, and you can actually make a real map based on the mapping rules. So that will be a later one. We didn't want to overload people, but that's kind of like the teaser. And I'm going to go ahead and drop those 2 links in the chat.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
And just to let you know, as Jennifer said, we will be having more training on the map drawing software. So we will, help guide you through it. Please go on and start playing around with it on your own, though. That's fine. But we'll try and help you as well. The other thing is, as Jennifer mentioned, she has been meeting with different league leaders in different areas around the state. She has a few left to still do, but so if you are interested in working on redistricting and want to get your hands on, doing some of this and helping in your community with the league's role in this, email Jennifer. It's real easy at the state office. We're all just our first name. So it's Jennifer at lwvny.org, and tell her that you're interested, and she can put you in touch with the people in your local league who are either she's already met with or have already expressed interest. Because many of you may not know that there are other people in your league that are interested in doing this. And so we're happy to connect you with anybody else who she's already met with, or other people in your area who are interested in working on this. So if you haven't heard about this, or if you're new to this, just ask Jennifer and she can figure out who in your area you can connect with. Eileen, I guess you have another question? You're on mute, Eileen.
It's just my way of seeing the downside and the upside. I always see both sides of the picture. So I'm sort of playing the devil's advocate. How do we react to what could be construed as special interests? Because when you start doing communities of interest, you have various locales, which have different interests for different things. So we listed all the things that we saw that could be a community of interest, and that could very much be in opposition to another community. So I see the possibility of being challenged with, well, it's like a special interest organization, a special interest approach.
Jen, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely, we said there's going to be communities of interest too, who are groups that have the same, like, let's say all their kids go to the same school, but they have different opinions about things and they don't necessarily agree on everything. And even within certain communities, certain ethnic communities of interest in New York City, at our panel presentation, Dr. Jerry Vanamala had mentioned that they were working on doing community mapping for all of New York City. They brought all of these different stakeholder groups together. And in the end, there was a division between two groups that represented the same communities who put forward different maps because they didn't agree on where the line should be. So it's definitely going to be a balance. And I personally don't think of things like water quality and air quality and my kids being able to go to school as like a special interest personally. So I don't think there'll be a problem with things like that. But yeah, definitely with some of the more, like, I guess you could say political led issues, there may be some division there that it's just going to be a balancing game. And ultimately, if leagues decide that all they want to do is educate and help inform these different groups and they don't want to help, or they want to help them like learn how to map, but they don't necessarily want to engage the mapping process because they don't want to pit groups against each other, we're totally fine with that. We want local leagues to do whatever they feel most comfortable doing. We don't want to pressure any groups to do anything that they don't want to do.
Any other questions? I'm not seeing any hands raised, but certainly, just let us know. I know that Jennifer covered a lot, and I even was talking to one person privately on chat and said, I always tell Jennifer, try to talk slowly because she can talk very fast and get through a lot of material all at once. But, she is very open to any questions that you might have. And as we said, it's all archived, so you can go back and listen to it again at any time. So, but we're happy to answer any questions you might have too. And Jane, I will tell you that, okay, Jane Thomas in the chat box is talking about Nassau County, that it takes an hour and a half to get from one to the other in one district. I will tell you that Barbara Bartoletti, as many of you know, who is our former legislative director, used to joke, I don't know if anyone from the North Country is on the call, is on this Zoom here. Oh yeah, Tom, you'd know, she used to talk about that it was the only time she felt like maybe she would advocate for Betty Little to be able to purchase a helicopter because she represented, I forget how many, Tom, you probably know how many counties she covered, and it's like it took hours and hours and hours to get from one end of her district to the other end of her district. So an hour and a half, that's not bad. It's all depends on it's all relative, Jane.
Betty's district, which is now Dan Steck's in the Senate, covers an area that's approximately the same size as Connecticut and Rhode Island combined.
Yeah.
Work on that, gang.
Thanks, Tom. I knew there was some story like that Barbara used to talk
12 counties.
About, so. 12 counties, okay.
Mary and I are here from Nassau County. The density in Nassau County certainly can't be compared to upstate. We can go from one block to another, you can go 100 feet and be in a completely different community that has very different needs and opinions. Last night at our League of Women Voters, we were discussing healthcare. Within our own group, there were differences in opinion. So you're not going to get 100% opinion about anything, no matter what the group is.
Right.
It's a challenge, but it certainly needs to be done. We also have many, many undocumented alien people who need to be represented as well. We have ethnic communities where people don't speak any English at all. So we have to get people who can help us to reach out to those communities. Mary and I are both educators, and so we have an interest in the education being equal and equal for the children. But we can go from Garden City, where I live, where the houses run for $2 million, to 10 blocks away, where people are on public assistance because they can't. There are people living in streets, so the needs are very different. And we're willing to do what we have to do, but we're going to need some help.
I think it's important, and I think those are really good comments, and I think it's important to reiterate what Jennifer has said before, that communities of interest may conflict with each other. There may be times when they're in the same area, but they're different interests, and they also may overlap with each other. We're not saying that all of these community interests are totally separate groups that that don't have any interaction with each other. It might be good interaction, it might be bad interaction, but the idea is if we can get the communities to determine what those communities of interest are, at least that should be a consideration given during the drawing of the maps. And so I think, Ann, what you're saying is, we're not saying this is going to be neat and easy and calm. I mean, but if we can get more people involved in doing it, we, as the league, always feel that, engaging more people and getting more voices heard in the process is really what we want. So that's the goal of all of this.
It's really what we want to do.
Yep.
To give people a voice. I think in Nassau County, we saw at the last election that because people got out to vote, because they were encouraged to vote, we did a lot of registration, that certain legislators got into offices who would never have gotten in before, because communities began to see their vote as important. So we want to continue that.
Great. I think Constance has a question. You have your hand raised. If you want to unmute yourself, Constance. I don't see her.
Yes, thank you.
There.
So I'm just curious, say if you get together with a group and you make up a new map that you think is a better map, and then you export it to either your commission or commissioner or legislative body. What's the process after that? Is it just up to someone how they feel about it, or are there laws saying we have to look at this? Does it go to committee? What's the next step after all that work?
Yeah, that's a great question. I can tell you for certain at the state level, the commission, it has to consider it, that they will consider it. And that's part of their work on this, is to make sure they're taking into account public comment. And I know we've been mentioning localities and participating with localities a lot on this, because it does seem like, oh my gosh, my community of interest, like, of course they're going to be part of this whole assembly district, but there is a certain level of the commissioners on the commission don't know every community in New York State. So even submitting public comments and public maps is so helpful for them to understand how the communities are different throughout New York State. Because yes, census data, population counts is going to guide this, but there's so much that the census doesn't talk about, and that's not included in the census, that they need the public comment to kind of fill in the gaps with the maps. But on the local level, unfortunately, I can't give you a straight answer on, because it really depends on the locality. And there's even some municipalities in New York State I've learned that don't even do redistricting. They're just at-large seats. And so there's not really even a process to participate unless the local league wants to advocate to add a process for local redistricting and actually have like seats that represent the different regions rather than just at-large town council people. So unfortunately, I can't give you a straight answer on that one. I would hope that if there is some sort of a legislative led commission doing redistricting at the local level, that they would consider those public comments. So that will definitely dig more into that, I think, when we move ahead with some of the public comment / testimony trainings we'll probably be doing in the next couple of months.
Oh, okay, that's helpful. Well, as you said, this really serves a different function from the census. I mean, they're related, but they emphasize very different things.
Yes.
This is much more in-depth to this community, whereas the census is more just about data gathering and.
Right.
Yeah.
I think Tom has a question. Tom, do you want to unmute?
Actually, I want to hitchhike on something that Jennifer said. At the county level, where you have county legislators or a county board of some sort, one of the counties up here has each town supervisor become the county board. So there's no districts or anything. If he's the town supervisor, he's also the legislator for that section. In another county, we have legislative districts that can include pieces of 2, 3, or 4 towns in order to get enough people. So check out your local area as to how it's set up. The really rural areas probably don't do a legislative district. They may just do the town supervisors, which is allowed in New York. But if you have a city or something that it's in there, then you're going to have all sorts of stuff for districts. Over and out. Thank you, Jennifer.
Yeah, and if those of you on this Zoom figure out how your local redistricting is done, please tell me, because I'm having the hardest time finding a master list of how every town, municipality, and county does redistricting. And every time I think I have a county straight and I check with the local league, they're like, oh no, Jennifer, that's not how it works here.
Are there any other questions? Oh, Suzanne, sorry.
And not a question so much as just a reinforcement of what Jennifer was saying. Our piece of this is to educate people, give people the information they need to make some noise. And keep making noise on the state level, on the county level, whether they have a process that's transparent or not. Start making noise that the process needs to be transparent. And we have had legislators telling us for so long that, no, it's important that they pick their districts. No. People need to have legislators that represent what they need, not what the legislatures want. So, and it's a conversation, it's hard to turn around because people have been hearing a different message for so long. And maybe we won't be 100% successful this time, but the more people we touch with this, the better chance we'll have of being more successful.
I think that's a pretty good spot to maybe end on. I think, Suzanne, that was good, upbeat, and exactly what we want to be doing here with the State League, helping all of you. We're not going to be doing this. Once again, we will provide the resources, the material, the training, but we are relying on all of you. And that's why we're always so appreciative that so many people are interested in doing this work with us, so that we can help you, but we're really relying on you all to work in your communities and see what we can do to make a better process. So I think, Janet, do you have some last comments you'd like to make?
I'm gonna put my email in the chat one last time. And yeah, thank you everybody for being on. There'll be much more information coming soon.
Great. Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone, and have a good
Bye.
evening.
Thanks, Jennifer and Laura.
Thank you.